It is a Friday morning. You know what time it is. That means the Big Daddy Liberty Show is on your radio waves. Syndicated, of course, from Chai FM. This is the podcast that will then be available later on in the day. Welcome to it. My name is Big Daddy Liberty. And we have an interesting show today as we look at, broadly speaking, economic recovery. You know, what should that look like? I'm sure most South Africans are at a point now where we're wondering, what to expect, and really what will build a country economically. So we're going to have that conversation with my major guest at 9:20 this morning. That's, of course, John Endres, who is the Chief of Staff, at the Institute of Race Relations, who released a very interesting paper this week, basically outlining what they call the easy steps to getting the economy up and running once again. So I'm going to have that conversation with him and basically juxtapose the two visions, I think, that have been presented in the public for economic recovery. One from government, which details a plan, a three-phased plan, which I'll get into after the break, and of course, the IRR's alternative proposal. So you can look forward to that conversation at 9:20 today. If you're just joining us, welcome to it. This is the Big Daddy Liberty Show, the podcast, syndicated here on Chai FM. Before my first break, as usual on the show, we will look at the news week that was. You know, what are some of the big news items that dominated headlines or things that got you interested, got you talking, for instance. So we're going to do that after the break. And as I mentioned, perhaps if you missed it, my major guest today is going to be John Endres, the Chief of Staff at the Institute of Race Relations, who've released a paper detailing what they consider are the easiest means, of getting the economy not only back on track, but they say to a 7% growth rate. Oh my, would we not want that as South Africans? So let me take my first break and I'll see you after these short messages. All right, guys, welcome back to the Big Daddy Liberty Show, the podcast edition here on Chai FM. Again, I'm going to hop straight into it because I think it's been a week where certain issues have dominated the headlines, but others have been lost, I think, in the noise. For instance, of what was the top issue in my view, which is the announcement of not only level 2 restrictions, which eased the previous restrictive regime of levels 3, 4, and 5, but particularly unbanned alcohol and tobacco. Of course, things got lost in the noise of that, with people, celebrating the faux freedom. And I call it faux freedom because really these are freedoms that should never have been restricted in the first place. They had no rational basis. But nonetheless, people celebrated this, and we sort of lost some of the other issues that are happening at the moment, mostly because they're not happening in big centers and big towns. I have in mind, of course, the tiny town of uMthwalume, which is south of Durban in KZN. Here's a town and a community really that is reeling with, let me just open my notes here, but it's effectively reeling with what is now 15 cases of missing people, 14 reported cases of missing people in that part of the world. And, it's been alleged or put forward, including by the police, by the way, that that there could very well be a serial killer in the area. Insofar as 5 bodies were found over the past couple of weeks, arrests were made. In fact, 2 arrests were made by the South African Police Services, with the one suspect seen as the prime suspect, if anything, later committing suicide in police custody. Now, obviously, this has frustrated a community which is incredibly worried about, what's happening. I mean, if you have 14 people missing in a community over a very short space of time, over a few months, and 5 bodies being found in quick succession, the fear that is obviously gripping the community has a lot of people worried as to whether policing in the area is even effective. To their credit, I know the police have put together a special team that will be looking into this, but The fear and the concern now comes after the person seen as the chief suspect in all of this commits suicide. Like, how does he take his secrets to the grave if he was involved in this? Because, of course, one has to use the word of this being an allegation at this point, or these allegations having been made against him, excuse me. But it does bring into question, what's happening in our communities across the country. I mean, we're currently in the month of August, which is seen as Women's Month. But in reality, how protected are South African women in this country? How many of these incidents are happening that we are not aware of because they're not maybe reported widely in the newspapers? In fact, even doing my research on this, I had to go to very specific newspapers, Isolezwe, the Zulu Medium newspaper out of KZN, because this story has barely broken, the national news cycle, which is a little odd to me, because it does seem as though, when you have a case of 14 reported missing people in the space of a few months, in a very small town, by the way, uMthwalume is a very small town, and 5 bodies having been found in very, rather short succession, that speaks to me as almost dealing with the case of, almost like a serial killer to an extent. But what struck me the most about this one is how we've relegated people because of poor policing and really a society where, we're not safe as citizens. We've relegated people to having to deal with these issues alone, effectively, where the state would much rather invest oodles amount of resources in policing, for example, an asinine lockdown ban on alcohol and cigarettes and all these other things that we saw under, the more restrictive lockdowns. They would rather and had rather invested heavy policing resources in that nonsense, as opposed to doing what is actually required by communities across this country, which is to protect our lives, our liberty, and really our property rights as citizens, from the poorest to the rich. So there's something fundamentally wrong and skewed when I sort of read the story. I was like, on what basis would you, as a community member, perhaps in uMthwalume, feel as though the policing priorities in your neighborhood are geared to your needs as a community? And clearly not, insofar as I don't think you would feel they're geared towards your community. Because there was a very interesting line in some of the newspapers that I read, where the community basically said, almost recognizing the failure of policing, said, I think they thought, at least, let me quote them properly, that they ought to take their own safety into their own hands. Now, I'm not necessarily against that, but also, that comes with the danger of potentially vigilante behavior. So again, it's something that police has to really take note of, because I don't think people are... There is an ever-shortening tolerance by South Africans for poor policing, and we're seeing that. Whether you live in the Western Cape, Gauteng, wherever in the country, there seems to be a growing, a shortening of tolerance for poor policing. It's worth noting, dear listener, because I think as we head into an economy that is absolutely decimated, with more people having lost their jobs, and what I would argue will be likely a rising crime rate, because more people are quite desperate, really, to subsist, it begs the question of what law and order will look like in our country when this happens, and whether the police really are up to the task. In addition, of course, to there being a need for the state to be up to the task generally of freeing the economy so that things get back not only on track, but we get on a growth trajectory. And that's the conversation we're going to have, I suppose, after the break. Because, again, for me, I'm really worried about this. Because on the one hand, you have poor policing, and on the other, you saw excesses by the state in terms of policing and putting military on the streets. As I quickly give you an update on the Collins Khoza case. Collins Khoza, of course, being the gentleman, 40-year-old gentleman from Alexandra, who in the first sort of week of the lockdown was murdered, allegedly murdered by the South African military, the Defence Force. As someone who was chilling in his yard, minding his own business, and the state, through the military, entered his yard and beat this man to death, allegedly. with, of course, the latest being the military ombudsman, of course, finding this week in its report that the soldiers who were involved in this incident had actually acted improperly. And the question now becomes, will there be justice? Will there be justice? Because I know his family, please God, I hope there will be justice, because I know his family have taken this matter to court, not only as a criminal matter, but also as a civil one, as they look for justice in a matter which really saw a South African, someone like you and I, being beaten to death allegedly at the hands of the South African government. That's the kind of stuff we used to see, willy-nilly under apartheid, and it's happening today. It cannot be. It cannot be. So I'm going to be watching that one again, because those are the two things that really dominated my thinking over this week in terms of what was in the news cycle. And these are the sort of stories that don't now break, into the mainstream in as wide a term. And they got buried, in the celebrations for alcohol and cigarettes. Come on, guys. There's something we need to do better in terms of following stories in this country and caring about each other as South Africans. Anyway, let me take my break, guys. Let me take my ad break. And after the break, in conversation with John Endres from the Institute of Race Relations. We're back on air. This is the Big Daddy Liberty Show, the podcast, of course, which is syndicated here on Chai FM and hopefully on other radio stations too. Remember, the podcast of the show will be available at 1 p.m. on Friday going forward. You'll find it on all your favorite podcasting sites, Spotify, Apple, Iono, and YouTube, you name it. Just look out for the podcast. We were just establishing my guest on the line. I can see he's on the line now. Let me just welcome him onto radio. John, good morning. You're on the Big Daddy Liberty Show.
Good morning, Sihle. How are you doing?
Excellento. Very good. I'm just going to try and raise your levels, John, just for a moment. But John, of course, is the Chief of Staff at the Institute of Race Relations. The Institute of Race Relations having released this week a very interesting paper that basically argues for the need, rightly of course, for growth and recovery after this lockdown period, recognizing the nature of, the decimated nature of the South African economy. John, let me just go straight to it. And, you guys make a very interesting claim in this paper, which I'm going to get to now. But essentially, the thrust of it being, it's very possible for South Africa, in a very cheap and cost-effective way, to sort of get to economic growth levels that could be as much as 70%, 70%, oh my, levels of 7% by the end of the decade. John, I'm going to get into that claim, but let me take 2, maybe even 3 steps back. Government has also released its own, I'll call it, reconstruction and growth policy document, arguing that it has 3 distinct phases and, the usual, it was dressed in the usual government, lingo. But it seemed, John, and this is what I wanted to put to you, it seemed as though when they released it, South Africans just seemed to say, blah, like, why should we trust this? We've never really, even before the lockdown, seen you guys grow this economy. We entered the lockdown in a recession.
That's right. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is a kind of planning season. So, all and sundry are publishing their plans. Everybody's trying to come up with ways to get us out of the crisis that we find ourselves in at the moment. And of course, 2 of the most prominent plans were published in July, one by the ANC, one by the Business for South Africa Business Alliance, which is big business effectively. And since then, we've seen more and more plans also coming out. But what we observed is that these plans share certain commonalities, which we think mean that these plans won't work. And what they share is that they all talk about social compacts, where business, government, and civil society have to come together to find a solution. We hear about creating employment schemes, using subsidies, reindustrializing, using infrastructure spending, and investing in the green economy. And, I think these proposals are all very well intentioned because they do want to create growth, but ultimately I think they will fail. And one of the reasons why I can say that is because all of those aspects which I mentioned just now are in the current growth plans, but they were also in the new growth path document which the Economic Development Department released in 2010. So we haven't changed our plans in the last 10 years. And we're in a deep hole. We were already in a deep hole before the COVID crisis, and things have only gotten worse. And we think we need a different approach. We need to look at this with fresh eyes.
Absolutely. And I want to take just a few minutes, please, just for the benefit of the listeners in particular, maybe just undressing some of these talking points that government often puts forward, and not only government, but government, big business, and really labor, as you mentioned it, of their particular vision of what a recovery strategy looks like. It often involves big spending, as you mentioned. The buzzword is often infrastructure spending. We often hear, and indeed the plan that I'm referring to in particular, released by government a couple of weeks ago, to which we're still waiting for the meat and potatoes of, was the state's economic reconstruction and recovery plan, close quote, which was the government's economic recovery proposals that were made at NEDLAC. And they set out these weird, almost in real government thinking here, somehow things work in phases. But it sets out these 3 phases of engage and preserve as level phase 1. Number 2, recover and reform. And phase 3, develop and transform. Now, John, when I read this, I said to myself, no. As usual with government, this is short on detail, it's long on rhetoric, and it's dressed in PR words, really. I mean, it was filled with things like, it'll have a value proposition on this, and it'll leverage on that. John, come on. Surely we need more meat and potatoes now as citizens as to what recovery looks like.
We do. And sometimes you do see specific proposals in these plans, but often you have to shake your head at what they are. And one of those proposals, I think, as part of the infrastructure plan, was to convert government buildings into green buildings and to empower communities to do this upgrading work themselves. And it is such a, it feels like such a helpless idea almost. That they're trying to come up with something that will work, and this is the best they can come up with, which is very strange. And I think, yes, you're right. It's long on rhetoric. Many of the proposals haven't been properly costed yet. But to give you one example, the business proposal, the B4SA proposal, was costed at 3.4 trillion rand.
Sure.
Over 3 years, which is just an absolutely unbelievable amount of money. And I really wonder where that money is going to come from in the conditions that we currently find ourselves in.
But I want to jump into that for a moment, John, because it seems as though that does seem to be the theme of what dominates mainstream thinking in let's call it in the finance and economics world around macroeconomic policy, issues of recovery economically, etc. There does seem to be a and again it cuts across both big business, big labor, and the state. The idea that you can spend your way out of trouble. Indeed, even if it means racking up massive debt and running up massive deficits, you can definitely spend your way, they'll have us believe, out of a crisis. For instance, the labor unions, that's Fedusa, COSATU, I can't think of the other one, also put out their paper basically calling for R1 trillion worth of stimulus spending to get us out of this debt. And it does beg the question, who pays for this? And where does this money come from? And what happens if it doesn't succeed? Who gets saddled with the debt?
Yeah, well, exactly. So that's also one of the big issues we have with these plans, which is, as we said, they are very, very expensive. But they impose the burden of that spending ultimately on citizens. So, if we do try to spend our way out of trouble, it means we'll either have higher taxes or higher debt or higher inflation if we print money, or outright dispossession, which means, government will take things like, for example, land or pensions and, just use those to try to spend its way out of trouble. And we think it simply won't work. The spending approach is futile. We need government to do less, not more.
Absolutely. Now, before I get to your particular interventions, which I think you quite rightly summarized as being, if we were to juxtapose it to the state at least, yours being a cheaper, quicker way to get things going versus the state, which is cumbersome and really rather expensive insofar as the big spending, big debt, big regulations. The other one area I just wanted to quickly jump on with you is, surely the one thing I found a bit odd, John, we hear the state almost speaking in very lofty terms around the state will do this, the government will do that, we'll set up a committee to do this. There seems to be a great emphasis on the creation of bureaucracies. And for me, and anybody who might be listening to this, they might be thinking, but hang on, we've seen what state bureaucracies generally look like, both in terms of the government itself, which has grown and ballooned in size, and linked to that, yoked to that is, state-owned enterprises, which are loss-making entities, yet also continue to grow in size and in their voracious hunger for state funds. Let me ask you a direct question. If we see the state heading down the direction of state-led growth, state-led interventions in the name of recovering the economy, can a South African reasonably foresee themselves, sorry, I got trapped by my own sentence construction there. Let me rephrase that. Does the state have the capacity, John, to really recover this economy through a state-centric approach like that? Is it actually a reasonable thing to believe that politicians can do this?
I think we don't have a snowball's chance in hell of doing that. Just given the track record of the ANC government over the past years, the amounts of inefficient allocation of resources, the amounts of money that get lost, the amount of money that gets stolen, is just so it boggles the mind how much money has been lost and how badly it has been spent. And to think that throwing more money at the problem will make the problem go away, I think is looking at it the wrong way around. I think it's just going to make those problems worse, in addition to being a drag on the economy.
All right. I'm going to play devil's advocate one more time here, John, before I really get into your plan. And forgive me if you really want to get into your stuff, but I must play devil's advocate because I know there'll be people who say the following. Oh, but John, they'll say, of course we need the state to get involved. In fact, what we need now are politicians who will do things like expropriate without compensation. Indeed, this crisis has opened up that door for us to do that. We need the state to actually expropriate property without compensation. We need things like the national health insurance. And of course, we need to double down on race-based legislation because you saw who were the biggest victims, John, of this lockdown, they'll say. It was mostly black South Africans. So, of course, we need to double down on race-based legislation where the winners and losers will be the former will be black, of course, who are the winners, and really whites can be losers because, white monopoly capital can take more of a knock. They can afford more of a knock. John, how would you respond to this? Because this is clearly how government thinks.
So my approach would be that in order for the nation as a whole to get richer, which will also make individual South Africans richer, we need to produce value. We need to think about productivity and, how much value each person can produce in South Africa. And the policies we currently have, the ones that you just mentioned, are precisely policies that get in the way of value production. These are things that will not allow us to become wealthier as a nation. Quite the contrary, they'll make us poorer as a nation. And that is, I think, maybe the most contentious part of the growth plan that we published. We name 3 bitter pills, which we think the government will need to swallow if it wants the economy to grow. And the first one is a very firm commitment to property rights. And that means abandoning pet projects like expropriating land without compensation. It means abandoning the idea of prescribed assets. And it also means abandoning the idea of nationalizing the healthcare system. Those things will really get in the way of producing value, of attracting investment, and of making the economy grow. The second thing that we call End for Two is race-based policies. So we think that BEE and affirmative action also get in the way of growth for companies. I think many black-owned businesses find them to be a burden unless they're doing business with the government, and certainly white-owned businesses do as well. And that is not to say that we don't have a problem that needs to be fixed in South Africa. We do, clearly. We've got this sky-high unemployment. We've got massive levels of poverty. We've got lots of people who don't really see prospects for themselves in this country and in this economy. And by some estimates, about 85% of the black population do not benefit from BEE policies. And they are being left behind and are being hurt by these policies. That's why we think they should be scrapped. We must find better ways of helping the poor to get out of poverty, to find jobs, and to make better lives for themselves. The third bitter pill that we list is a very wide-ranging liberalization of the labor market. So at the moment, we think that employers hesitate before employing new staff because they know that new staff can be a liability. It can be difficult to scale up or scale down the business in response to changing demand. And so employers are cautious and conservative. And what we would like is for employers to feel very free to employ people. Give them a chance, even if it's at a low wage, even if it is on a short-term contract or at the risk of losing that job if the economy contracts again. At least get people into jobs in the first place. That's very, very important. And for that also we would oppose the minimum wage because we think it is more important for people to have a chance to get a job, even if it is a low-paying job, than not to be given that chance because the minimum wage is too high.
Absolutely. Now, John, you guys say something very interesting in the report, which I wanted to speak to, which is, the idea underlying all these elements really of this plan is what South Africa needs, you argue, which is more than anything else, it's economic growth. Do you want to maybe talk to me about that? Because, a unionist might say, of course you guys will say economic growth, but it'll be jobless growth, they might say. But how would you respond to that? And really, why is economic growth important?
Yeah, so the idea of jobless growth is a myth. The problem we've had is too little growth in South Africa, and that's why our unemployment rate isn't coming down. But there was a period in the mid-2000s where we benefited from somewhat better policies and a favorable economic climate internationally, where we did hit quite high growth rates, around 5% or so. And that was the period where unemployment came down in South Africa. And of course, that is what we need to replicate. We need to hit higher growth rates in order to bring unemployment down and help these millions and millions of people who are currently stuck without prospects.
All right, I'm in conversation, if you're just joining us, with John Endres from the Institute of Race Relations. We're talking about the growth and recovery document. This is a strategy to #GetSA working, they say. Now, this is a fantastic document. I've just gone through it. I really encourage you to read it. It's on their website. That's irr.org.za. Just look under their report section. That's the growth and recovery strategy to get SA working. I'm still in conversation with them. I'm going to take a quick ad break. After the break, we go into the report with a little bit more detail, so we can find out what some of these innovative ideas the IRR have up their sleeve. Welcome back to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I am Big Daddy Liberty, your classical liberal for street fighter for classically liberal ideas. Oh my goodness, it is a Friday morning indeed. It is Erev Shabbos, so good Shabbat to everybody who's maybe joining. I am in conversation with John Endres, who is the Chief of Staff at the Institute of Race Relations. They've released a very interesting report, an alternative vision, if you will, for getting South Africa not only back on track after this lockdown, but also to actually grow the economy. It's a document entitled Growth and Recovery, a strategy to get South Africa working. I am in conversation with John right now. John, in the last sort of 8 minutes that we have, I really want to just touch on each of the headings that you have in this report that I think warrant a conversation. And I then encourage everybody to just read the paper online. You guys basically make it quite clear here that there is a desperate need to attract direct investments to get the growth rate up. Do you want to maybe quickly talk to this and the issue of property rights once again?
Yeah, so we think that there's actually a big opportunity for South Africa here. And the reason why we say this is that if we look at the global environment, we see very high levels of stimulus in the developed nations. And we see that returns and yields are hard to find worldwide. So investors are scanning the world. They're looking for places where they can get good returns on their investments. And if we could make a case for South Africa to be one such place, then we think it would be very possible for us to attract investment. But for that to happen, of course, the framework conditions have to be right, and investors have to be certain that they're not going to lose their investments because of some form of expropriation or insecurity about property rights. And that is why we link those two ideas. We say, you have to guarantee property rights. You have to make sure that investors know that they will be able to get a return on their investment and keep their assets as well. They're not going to lose them to the government.
And then you make an important point here, because a lot of people go, oh, well, there they go again, trying to say that the state has no role to play and that it should be the laissez-faire market economies, as we often hear detractors say about you guys. But really, you guys actually say, no, there is a role for the state, where you say creating an effective state and a competitive investment climate. Don't maybe just quickly unpack that?
Yes, so we've heard similar messages from the government as well. So that where the rhetoric used to be all about the developmental state just a couple of years ago, we are now hearing talk about the desire to have a capable state. And of course, that is something that I think the DA had as part of its policy platform for quite a long time. I think the ANC is now also adopting it. And of course, it is a very important thing. The state has a major role in the economy and in the lives of ordinary people. And where it does not fulfill that role effectively or fairly, citizens suffer. And that's where we say what is necessary is to make the government bureaucracy a lot more efficient, to overcome rigid labor laws, and also to undo the excessive red tape which we've got. We need to simplify the citizens' and businesses' interactions with the state.
Now, John, this is where you won me over in this document, and really it spoke to what I think is the quintessential difference between your approach here and the state's approach, which is you guys say that we actually need to create an entrepreneur-friendly economic climate. Now, this juxtaposes with what the state has been doing, which is focusing on big business, big labor, and of course itself. Do you want to maybe just really unpack that and the importance of an entrepreneur-friendly economic climate?
Yes, so the government finds it difficult to engage with small businesses. And I think it's because of the ease of engagement that government often prefers to interact with big business. Now, with big business, you have a few parties that you need to interact with, maybe, 40 or 100 companies, and then you've covered most of it. But if you as the government wanted to interact with small business, there might be 100,000. And how do you talk to them, and how do you interact with them? It's very difficult. And that's why we think that government often is a bit at a loss about what to do about small business. And there, the point we make is that really the best thing that government can do is to get out of the way. Small businesses have enough troubles as is, in terms of finding finance, securing their supply chains, getting the work done if you haven't got a whole team of professionals helping you, as large companies do, but having to do everything yourself. So life in small business is quite tough. And that is where we say that to create an enabling climate for entrepreneurship, we should actually exempt small and micro businesses as well as new startups from all labor regulation. We would say, guys, go out and employ people. Find the people that you need, employ them without having to worry too much about the red tape. But the main thing is to get people into work. We also think that the government should actually turn a blind eye to small entrepreneurs who currently might not be 100% compliant with all regulations. Rather, let them build their businesses, let them grow until they become more and more integrated into the formal economy, at which time you can then regularize their status. And we have a few other proposals, but in essence, the point we're making is that we need to increase our economic freedom rankings, which are a sort of encapsulated form of expressing a business-friendly climate. And in those rankings, we've been dropping. So in 2000, we were at a rank of about 47 out of about 150 countries, and we're now ranked 101st. That was in 2017. So our economic freedom has been declining quite severely over the last 20 years or so, and we need to get it increasing again. We need to be economically free.
Absolutely. John, I'm pressed for time, but I do want to squeeze this in, which is, you guys basically say, there is a need, to broaden and, of course, speed up economic participation. Now, when you say this, most South Africans gravitate towards what we know, which is, BEE and employment equity policies, which are, of course, race-based. But you guys make a different argument, don't you?
Yeah, so we also favor empowerment, and we also see a role for the state in doing so. We think that having race-based procurement is harmful. Procurement should be based only on price, quality, and the ability to deliver. But we also do think that giving people the resources they need to make better lives for themselves includes things like healthcare, like education, like housing. But the proposal we make there is that the resources for these things should not be funneled through a very large and opaque government bureaucracy, but rather put directly in the hands of citizens. So we would say if you have a low income in your household, you would qualify to receive a voucher which will allow you to buy schooling services, educational services, that is, healthcare services, or even housing from whoever you like. And that could be, a government supplier, but it could be a private supplier. And we think that most people, given the choice, would probably take that voucher, that money which is in their own hands, and take it to a place where it is well spent, which will often be a private sector supplier.
Absolutely. No, these are fantastic ideas. And of course, we've run out of time. But again, if you want to read these yourself and really arm yourself, sharpen your own arguments around what we can do to not only get the South African economy back on its feet, but really to a point where we're growing and we're thriving, please do head over to the Institute of Race Relations website and click on the Growth and Recovery, a strategy to get South Africa working document. John, thank you very much for your time. Just maybe as a final word to you, how do we get in touch with the IRR and you on social media?
So we're on all the social media platforms as well as online. Just search for Institute of Race Relations or IRR. And also consider following The Daily Friend, which is a website, a news website, like a newspaper, with great analysis from some of South Africa's best columnists.
Fantastic. That is John Endres, the Chief of Staff from the IRR. Major thanks to him. After the break, we wrap up the show and we look at who the Moomish of the week is. All right, guys, welcome back to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Yo, what a week, guys. And maybe looking forward into the week and this weekend and next week, stay tuned to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. This Sunday, of course, I'll be having my usual episode of Late Nights with BDL. That's at 9 p.m. on YouTube. Look out for that. As I'll have a very special guest as we wrap up this news week with them, and someone who will provide some great analysis for you. So look forward to that in conversation, of course, with a special guest. I won't reveal that quite yet, but what you've been waiting for. At the end of all podcasts, I always reveal who the Moomish of the week is this week. This one will perhaps even make you giggle a bit because they've been Moomish of the week now, I think, twice. This will make them twice. But of course, I'm talking about the National Coronavirus Command Council, this superpower committee that has been created by the state that almost has unchecked powers, unaccountable, not really founded in real terms in law, that we have no idea really what basis they operate on, but are still here. And they've made their announcement, of course, that they're taking us to level 2 lockdown. And finally, I suppose, have given us our freedoms back for those who enjoy alcohol and their cigarettes. But again, this is nothing to be celebrated. And what really irked me is the Minister for Cooperative Governance, that's Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, appearing before our screens, after the president, of course, almost in a celebratory tone, suggesting that, we're giving you your freedoms back, to now enjoy a drink or to enjoy a cigarette. And, it was almost pitched in a tone of, you need to be grateful that we, the politicians, are doing this, Without us, you just wouldn't have these freedoms. It's absolute nonsense. It is absolute nonsense. And this idea that politicians should have this power is exactly why we're in the trouble that we're in now. So they deserve Moomish of the Week for that condescending tone that they took with us, suggesting that freedoms that are already ours as South Africans, we should be grateful for when politicians hand them back to us after a torrid few months of state repression and violence against South Africans, with 300,000 people arrested in this country, people beaten on the streets, nearly 20 people murdered at the hands of the state under this lockdown, which still continues to this day. So they deserve Moomish of the Week. What a bunch of losers. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for listening to the Big Daddy Liberty Show, the podcast. Remember, this will be available in a podcast format after about 1 p.m. On Friday, and available, of course, on all your favorite podcasting streams, including on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you so much for listening. I am Big Daddy Liberty. I'll see you next week on Friday again for the podcast.